to the United Nations and to the World Trade Organization in Geneva. He's currently the CEO and president of the Nakasone Peace Institute. It's a pleasure for NBR to be collaborating with NPI. Ambassador Fujisaki, let me turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Willis. It's a great honor for Nakasone Peace Institute, NPI, to collaborate with NBR. We really look forward to this. This subject is very timely, and I think we all have lots of interest in this, both sides in the Pacific. It's multifaceted. You have economy, you have security, you have technology, and China's strength has been backed by first, initially state-supported big companies help with large population, and that has led to the lead in 5G and also the military-connected capabilities, cyber and those which we don't have. So, for example, unlike the United States, which has a robust background for startups, Japan had been, very frankly, left behind in these areas, 5Gs and technology. China. Also, China was helped by rather, if I may be very blunt, short-sighted Europeans when they started AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. UK, Germany all jumped on the wagon to rush as well. And Germany approached China, and their dependency on Russian oil and natural gas is really awesome. So, but I think United States and Japan, Canada sort of remained as not try to miss the bus psychology. Now, China's golden time is sort of evaporating a bit because thanks to two things. One, Xi himself, Xi Jinping, he has pushed the alarm bell himself. Manufacture 2025, BRI, China's Dream 2049, Wolf Warrior diplomacy after COVID-19, all these have really awakened us. Thanks to Mr. Xi pushing bell himself. And Mr. Trump, as well as Mr. Biden, is inheriting this. And the notion that we have wakened up. We have now Frankenstein with AI. Now, another element is Ukraine. It's telling us that worst thing can happen. And we should not depend too much on unreliable partners. US and Japan has less than 10% energy dependence on Russia, whereas Europe has nearly 50%. And I think that kind of very prudent, of course, US has been helped by its natural resources, but diplomacy is really important now. Because of these background, even before Ukraine, both sides have started to really awaken ourselves, and Japan is coming up with the Japan Economic Security Legislature. It'll be, we'll have it in a few months, and in order to sustain stable supply of essential like semiconductor, drugs, rare earth, and those things as well, with intellectual property rights fortified. And the US side has legislature, defense budget is $813 billion, which was proposed by Biden administration. And DOD has come up with a new national defense strategy day before yesterday, which says that you have to really have awareness to multi-domain threat of PRC. So I think we can now compare notes and collaborate. This is a very important timing. What's important for Japan, if I may say one thing in the end, is that we want United States to remain steadfast and not try to change its course I'll be maybe too blunt, but we have experiences in semiconductors in 1980s, auto parts in 1990s, and TPP in 2010s, American policy change. Of course, if a administration changes, of course, it's they have all the right to change policies, but still, at least we would like Americans to stay on a rather range of course, which is not that too far or too left. But this is just as a footnote, I'd like to make remarks. But there are so many experts today, so I would not take more time. I think I would like to just stop here and look forward to learning a lot from this meeting. Thank you very much.
Ambassador Fujisaki, thank you so much for those opening remarks. Point well taken. I think it's been interesting to work on policy issues in the last few years and to see how partners in the Indo-Pacific have reacted to these bigger swings, as you described them, in US policy approaches. Let me turn now, though, to our keynote speaker this evening and introduce Professor Shin Kawashima. Professor Kawashima is a professor of international relations at Tokyo University. He's also a senior fellow at the Nakasone Peace Institute, and he's held a number of consulting and advisory positions for Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and National Security Agency. And he's going to make a keynote address here. So, Professor Kawashima, let me turn the floor over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's my pleasure to join this very interesting and stimulating conference. And thank you, President Michael Wills of NBR, to share this conference with us. Today, we have the excellent simultaneous interpreter, so I will speak in Japanese. So please set the simultaneous translation interpretation system. 日本語でそれではお話をしたいと思います。今日の話題というのは、中国のデジタルの戦略等でございますので、私自身が中国研究者ですので、中国の意図、その問題点、こちらの対処のある種の課題というものについてお話ができればと思います。10分間程度の話です。まずですね、中国自身は、このデジタル戦略というものは、おそらく2015年の、第13次5カ年計画、ここから始まったわけですね。で、昨今では2020年に、中国産業デジタル化報告というものを発表するなど、いわゆる DX 化には非常に力を入れているわけであります。で、なぜかというと、まず第一に、中国は昨今ですね、自らの正当性、レジティマシーについて、これまでは革命と、ナショナリズムと、豊かさがあったんですが、そこに新たに科学技術、テクノロジーというのを加えたわけですね。で、そのテクノロジーというものが、中国共産党政権の正当性を支えるものであるというふうな認識を強めているということがまず第一にあると思います。それから第二に重要なことは、人口減少に伴うですね、そのサステイナブルな経済発展戦略の上で、このデジタル化がどうしても必要になるということであります。単純労働の無人化、自動化というものが大きな課題になっていて、それによって人口減少というもののダメージを小さくするということを彼らは想定していると思われます。それから第3に、世界経済が今後、デジタル化の部分で、そこが最新の領域になるということが分かっているので、その部分においてイニシアチブを取って世界経済をリードするとともに、そこにおける規範形成というものに中国が、規範形成において主導性を取るということを考えているんだと思われます。また、このデジタル化というのは当然国内政治、国外、対外的な外交に関わりますので、国内統治の効率性、効果を上げていくということが考えられているはずです。また、5番目に軍事力の基礎にもなりますので、そこも大いに考慮されているはずであります。でまた、中国はこの体制というもの、このデジタル化を進めることがですね、社会主義体制というものの中で進めやすい、他の先進国よりも優位にあるという部分があるわけであります。つまり、いわゆる社会実装が極めて早く、またあるデジタル化の政策を進めても、それが進みやすい、先進国よりも進みやすいという、ある種の 利点があるというふうに思っているはずであります。中国自身が進めようとしている領域は、デジタル面でのインフラ建設、海底ケーブル、ビッグデータ等の施設がありますけれども、デジタルのインフラ建設も、それから電子商取引、これは越境 e コマースも含みますけれども、オンライン決済、そしてまたデジタル技術を応用したプロジェクト、またデジタル関連人材の育成などがあります。フォアウェイなどは、マレーシアにおいて大量のデジタル人材を養成するというプランを発表しています。でまた中国はこのコロナ禍においてもデジタルインフラ建設、このデジタルインフラ建設というのはこれからの鍵になりますけれども、それを推進しているわけであります。昨今中国は共同富裕、コプロスペリティというのを発表していますけれども、共同富裕の富裕ですね、豊かになるという部分については、このデジタルインフラ建設が鍵になっています。しかし中国政府はこのデジタルインフラ建設というのは効率性を持って行う、つまり中国に全体に一気にできるわけではなくて、特定の部分に、ある種大都市部でありますとか、特定のスマートシティに重点的に建設を行うというふうに言っておりますので、デジタルインフラ建設は逆に格差を生み出すという問題点があります。ですので、共同富裕という言葉を使いながら、富の分配というものを進めるというプランだと思われます。対外政策を見ますと、中国は2017年からデジタル一帯一路というものを推進しようとしています。これは国内におけるデジタルインフラ建設とパラレルに進むといいますか、一帯一路は国外政策というよりは国内政策の部分も十分にありますので、それが一体で進んでいるというのが目下の状況かと思います。で、2019年4月までに中国はデジタルシルクロード共同建設に関する覚書メモランダムを19の国と調印して、その後もどんどん増やしていますし、また FTA を結ぶ際に電子商取引等に関する条項をどんどん含み込むようにしています。そして2020年にはグローバルデータセキュリティイニシアチブというものを発表し、このデジタル、建設、あるいはそれにまつわるデジタル経済の領域における国際ルールの策定に意欲を見せていますし、2021年秋には中国 ASEAN デジタル経済協力関係の構築に関するイニシアチブというものも相次いで発表していて、一帯一路空間におけるデジタル建設を進めています。これは先ほど言いましたように、例えば新疆ウイグルにおいて、新疆ウイグルにおいても、巨大なスマートシティを作って、そこと中央アジアを結びつけるということをどんどんやっているわけであります。では、このような中国のデジタル建設の問題点はどこにあるのか、これは皆様ご存知のように、第一に中国自身がインターネット主権という考え方を持っているように、デジタルの空間を開かれたものとして想定していないという点があるわけであります。これは大きな我々と違いです。また、第二に中国がデジタル空間を利用して、情報をある種コントロールしながらですね、これは対内面においては、例えば、よく言うんですけれども、中国で遅延中と言いますが、簡体字中国語しか見ない国民、おそらくこれは9割以上いると思われますけれども、彼らの中にある種の情報、共産党に都合のいい情報を流し込むことができますし、対外的にはフェイクニュース等々を流すことができるわけであります。これは対外と言いましたけれども、香港や台湾に対しても頻繁に行われている点でもあります。それからデジタル産業とですね、新疆における問題、分かるように、この問題というのは人権問題にも深く関わることがございます。また、法の域外適用の問題とこのデジタル問題が深く関わっていて、海外に進出した中国企業の情報というものが中国政府に流れたり、いうこともございます。この法の域外適用というのは新しい論点かと思います。それからまたアメリカをはじめとする先進国はこういう中国の状況に対してさまざまな制裁を実施しています。プライマリーサンクション、一連のものがあるかと思いますけれども、しかしながら中国側もそれに対して多様な法律を制定し対抗しているわけであります。特に昨年9月、2021年9月に施行されたデータセキュリティ法というものは、中国における国家の安全の論理を全面的に押し出した対抗措置になっています。これは中国に進出しているアメリカ、日本等の外資系企業に対しても大きなプレッシャーになっています。今後、日米同盟あるいは先進国の間に何ができるのかということは大変大きな課題になります。 まず第一に、やはり今回中国がフォアウェイマリーン等で進めている、海底ケーブル、あるいは陸上のケーブルですね、等があるわけですけれども、そうしたものに対して先進国がどのように共同して対抗するか、あるいはこちらの方でもインフラを進められるのかということが第一にあります。第二に、デジタルエコノミー関連の規範形成の面で、先進国がこれ何か触れることができるのかという論点があるわけです。中国は、通商面のルールに関しては、RCEP、あるいは FTAP 等において、デジタルトランスフォーメーションに関わる商取引、また通商面でのルール化、制度化をどんどん進めています。このルールの場に関与すべく昨今では、デジタル経済連携協定 DEPA にも参加を表明しています。そうした中で、この先進国の方の側がどのようにこのような通商面、デジタル通商の面でのルール化に関われるのか、あるいは主導できるかということがあるわけであります。また中国はこのような商取引デジタルの建設を一帯一路空間で進め、そこにおけるルール化も進めていますので、日本やアメリカ等々がアジアやアフリカを含めたそうした途上国、開発途上国も含めた空間において、どれだけ魅力あるある種の商取引の習慣なりデジタルのインフラを作れるのかという焦点がございます。また、中国国内における、日本やアメリカの外国系企業等々、あるいは外国における中国企業の活動というのをどういうふうに管理していくのかということも大きな課題となりまして、中国自身が行っているさまざまな規制の影響力を最小限に進めていくということ、最小限にするということが大いにあるんだと思っています。こうした新しい領域というのは、中国は古い産業領域というのはそこにおける規範は取れないと思ってますけれども、新しい領域というのは中国にとってはこれからルールを自分たちで作れるかもしれない。そこにおけるテクノロジーの面でも主導して、かつルールも作れるというふうに彼らは考えていますので、ここは大きな論点になるだろうと思っております。私からの報告は以上です。ありがとうございました。
Thank you so much, Professor Kawashima. You've raised a number of critically important questions, and those questions have actually been at the heart of a recent NBR research initiative, several of the authors and contributors to which are here with us today for this discussion. About a month ago, we published a report on China's digital ambitions, which was really trying to understand many of those questions that you've put out on the table for us today. What is China trying to achieve with its build out of physical infrastructure, the undersea cables, the telecommunications networks? How is China trying to change norms around digital trade, data transfer, data privacy, and setting standards for digital growth, which will affect economic growth in the future? And then, as you mentioned, these developments, given the nature of China's regime, have pretty significant concerns for Western democratic countries and democratic countries across the Indo-Pacific region. I'm going to turn quickly to our panelists so that we can kind of dive into a conversation about this. And our first panel is organized around trying to understand what China's digital ambitions are. And so let me introduce the three speakers here. Emily de la Bruyere is the first. She is the principal investigator of our recent study, a non-resident fellow here at NBR, and the co-founder of Horizon Advisory in Washington, D.C. She's joined by Karen Sutter, one of the contributors to our report. Karen is an analyst at the Congressional Research Service, a long career with the US government, and I do have to note that her comments here this evening are being made purely in her personal capacity, and they do not reflect US government position in any way. And our final speaker is Juno Osawa, who is, with the Nakasone Peace Institute, senior research fellow there. He's also directing a cyber project with the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. And so what I'd like to do is have Emily up first, a few minutes of remarks, then we'll turn to Karen, and then we'll turn to Professor Osawa, and then we'll begin a moderated Q&A. And as Audrey mentioned at the beginning, if you have questions, please feel free to email those to events@nbr.org, and we'll try and get to as many of those as we can in the time that we have available. But Emily, let me turn over to you now.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you for putting this together. And I too try to be somewhat brief remarks, but I'm going to start with presenting what I hope is an overall framing of how we see China's digital ambitions and how we seek to map them out in this report. So the overall diagnosis of the project is that China sees a new industrial revolution underway. It's catalyzed by the emergence of data as a factor of production, and it brings about, it means a reshuffling of the global order. China sees this digital revolution as a competitive opportunity, a chance to not just rise within the existing international system, but to challenge it, to leapfrog the incumbent order. Beijing diagnoses that the way to do that is to claim control over data, and that in doing so, China can claim control over the world order. What that control means is, at a first level, superior access. China's trying to develop, lock in greater points of access to international data, whether that's through digital infrastructure or through digital platforms. But the beat beyond that is that China is also trying to shape the flow of international information to determine what information moves where, to whom, at what pace. Because China recognizes that if it can do that, it can shape both the virtual and the physical environments, because both of those depend on the flow of data. And this promises competitive advantage across everything from military to commercial to informational domains. Control over data flows means better and more precise and more targeted propaganda and misinformation. It means not only feeding a competitive advantage into companies that might acquire superior information, but also shaping the information environment in which those companies compete and bestowing superiority to them. It also means claiming better information on a military battlefield and the ability to distort or deny that of the adversary. How does China pursue this vision? We see it as a mutually reinforcing top-down and bottom-up approach. China, on the one hand, builds digital infrastructures, physical and virtual, platforms, which I think Karen will talk about, and also physical systems like telecommunications and data centers and satellites. From the top down, China is also seeking to shape digital governance and standards regimes to lock in this kind of competitive and architectural advantage. Throughout the process, China benefits from a set of structural advantages that might be uniquely determinative in this competition. Those include its size, its centralization, which allows it to marshal that size and to ensure that the private sector, which is where so much of this competition is playing out, follows Beijing's strategic goals. And then also China's industrial capacity grants it leverage over the international private sector, as well as its own, and gives it quite simply the ability to pursue its competitive ambitions, whether that's in terms of supply chains or in terms of building out infrastructure systems across the world. This presents an enormous challenge. It presents one that really threatens the global order across domains, and it presents one that, to our mind, cannot be met without international coordination. And on that front, I will cede my time.
Thank you so much, Emily. I like your conclusion there on the need for international coordination. Definitely a theme we want to come back to in the Q&A. Karen, can we turn to you now for some remarks on your chapter?
Sure. It's a great honor to be, again, part of the NBR project and part of today's panel. I looked at digital platforms as part of the project, China's digital platforms. I looked at a variety of platforms, and just to frame the discussion, transaction platforms that deal with trade and payments, retail, information platforms that deal with messaging, social media and news, super apps like WeChat, industrial platforms that deal with manufacturing. There's a lot of coordination between these platforms in China and Europe, countries like Germany. Innovation, basically China's efforts to develop a competitor to Microsoft's GitHub, as well as pharmaceutical innovation companies like Wuxi AppTech and BGI. Infrastructure in smart cities, and also enterprise industry software. So looking at back office platforms in the hotel and entertainment industry, for example. I looked at several case studies, Alibaba's World Trade Platform, People's Bank of China's digital central bank digital currency, smart grids plans for cross-border trade of renewable energy, industrial, and then the industrial platforms. And in this research, I found 6 core takeaways that I wanted to share just very briefly for purposes of discussion. The first is the role of the state. And I think this is something that is well discussed and documented domestically in China. But the powerful and growing role of the state also goes with these corporate actors and digital platforms when they leave China. These same points of control and touch points we talked about earlier, Digital Silk Road, One Belt, One Road projects, where you see the government and Chinese digital platforms working together, sometimes one coming before the other. Sometimes platforms using core technologies developed by state institutes. And so all of these things, I think, just to emphasize, number one, the role of the state in China's digital platforms is a fundamental point. Number two is that China's using actors to develop and implement digital platforms that are ostensibly, to the outside, appear to be private corporate actors. And so this presents unique challenges in foreign countries, for foreign governments, for others who interact with these platforms, because most markets are open to commerce. They're open to research institutes, they're open to companies coming into the market, and it's easy to miss some of the strategic ramifications of what China is doing on a case-by-case corporate transaction basis, as far as what China is trying to build domestically and then translate into the global arena. The third issue, which I think is very important, is and it's understood, but it's not talked about probably enough, are the asymmetries in market access. The inherent lack of reciprocity in US and other foreign companies being able to go in and build digital platforms, internet and software-based services in China. While China is allowed to develop its digital platforms in a very protected market that is the largest in sense of e-commerce in the world. And then in turn, these Chinese companies are allowed to go offshore, basically unrestricted, because they're operating in a lot of unrestricted or gray areas. And so I think that's something to think about. The other area with this lack of reciprocity is China has a trade posture that is very actively seeking to bring down global barriers to digital trade, while it's keeping its own market protections in place. And so a lot of what China is relying on to expand and develop its digital platforms overseas is dependent on third markets reducing their barriers to one another, while China in turn keeps its barriers high. So it's securing all these commitments while China may not actually license participants in its own market. And so this was something, I think it's important to watch, because some of China's plans may seem somewhat nascent or far-fetched, but they really rely on barriers coming down more generally in global markets. The fourth area I wanted to highlight is something that Professor Kawashima had mentioned. It's this issue of centralization and convergence. And I think that's very important in the Chinese context in 3 areas. One is the issue of platform integration. The idea that because the state has touch points and controls with each platform, and because China requires real identification in the use of platforms, and because the state controls behind the scenes, that there's a very powerful sense of integration that can happen. We've seen this with surveillance of the Uyghurs. We've seen it in Hong Kong. We've seen it with the use of propaganda. We've seen it with COVID controls and QR codes. This is something that can be translated overseas that can be very powerful and amplified, I would argue, quite quickly. You also have what's happening more generally in economic activity, the digitalization of all kinds of activity. And so this convergence is in that second area as well. And then the third area of convergence is what China is trying to do in its industrial policies with regard to both hardware and software and services, that this integration, and I argue in the chapter that digital platforms are the point where all of this could converge and come together and prove to be quite powerful because of China's ability to work across these platforms, across this infrastructure, across these services. The fifth point is that China is a latecomer to digital technology. It's a latecomer to digital platforms, but I think there's a risk of underestimating what they might be able to achieve. And I'll just mention a couple of things. China is seeking a first mover advantage. in particular in new technologies such as blockchain. It's looking at breaking into new markets. And just to emphasize that digital technologies are inherently disruptive. They're disruptive to established industries. And I think it's important to note, as we focus on the digital domain, China, through digital activity, is breaking into foreign markets that are traditionally deemed as very protected, very sensitive critical infrastructure: health, finance, media, power, energy, government e-services. These are all areas where you see Chinese digital platforms entering. And so it's not just that they have a digital presence, but it's a back way of getting into other very sensitive areas. The sixth point I want to make just in closing is that it seems to me in my research that foreign countries, United States, key ally, Japan, key allies and partners, have a lot of points of leverage and control. And I'll just mention a couple of them. The US, Japan, and others are technology leaders, and they still control a lot of the underlying hardware and software technologies that China needs to develop and deploy its digital platforms. We also, other countries, control market access, whether China comes or not, and the terms in which Chinese firms come or not. And I think that's why I emphasize this issue of state control and state touch points in China's digital platforms. It's not a normal digital platform. And so this question of how do you treat a digital platform that has so many points of state influence? Do you treat them as a normal company, or what other kinds of issues does this raise? Are you country agnostic or not? And then the last point I'll make is that China's expansion overseas, I mentioned they were a latecomer, but they're catching up. A lot of the gains that they've made have been through foreign acquisitions. And it's basically the ability to move into a market and then also to inherit sometimes business licenses in sensitive sectors. It has happened in the United States, it's happened in Europe, it's happened in Latin America, Southeast Asia, South Asia. You see it in a lot of these markets. And so again, these are all points of control, I think, for countries to think about. How do they view Chinese digital platforms, both at a tactical and a strategic level? And what kinds of access are we allowing? And is that same access reciprocated in China? So anyway, just to stop here, but just some points for consideration.
Thanks so much, Karen. I appreciate you laying those out so clearly for us. Let's turn now to our third speaker, Professor Jun Osawa from the Nakasone Peace Institute. Professor Osawa was not one of the authors of our report, but these are issues that he's focused on for a long time in his career. So let me turn it over to you now for some remarks.
Very much, Vice President Michael-san. So I guess my great honor to be here today with the NBR, such distinguished colleagues and the Japanese distinguished audience, more than 50 persons. So I would like to speak about the Chinese dream of digital hegemony based on the historical issue. China holds a long-term national strategy called the Chinese Dream to overtake the United States to become the world's leading hegemony power by 2049. As a policy to realize the Chinese dream, China has launched the Digital Silk Road initiative that Professor Kawashima mentioned before, and is developing an IoT platform on an information and telecommunication infrastructure in attempt to capture the power to control information from the United States by enclosing information not only in the Eurasian continent, but also in the whole of the world. So our key questions are, first, what condition will be necessary for China to overtake the US as the world leading power by the middle of the 21st century? And the second question is what policies is China implementing in order to fulfill the condition for the hegemonic power? I'd like to start my presentation with some of the history surrounding hegemonic powers and information and communication technologies. 200 years ago, in the first half of the 19th century, the UK was the first country to succeed in the Industrial Revolution and become the world dominant power. In addition to factors of national power such as population, resources, and technologies, what supported the hegemony of the British Empire more was Britain's naval power, and second, international key currencies, pound sterling, and the third most important point is information network of submarine telegraphs. The submarine cable network across the world gave the UK an information advantage, especially these kind of new technology at that time, submarine telegraph used for financial transaction and defense intelligence gathering. So the next, in the 20th century, the next hegemonic power, the US, is also supported by its power to control the information network. In addition to its national power in terms of economic, military, or technological dominance, the current internet is transmitted over the optical submarine cable that stretch around the world. The telecommunication flow is controlled by the more than a dozen telecommunication companies in what is called Tier 1 networks. Of these, more than half of US companies has the control of the Tier 1 network. In addition, Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, ICANN, a US nonprofit organization established in 1998, is responsible for managing the technical rules of global internet communication. And the US government has a certain degree of influence to control these kind of rules. In this way, the hegemonic powers have maintained their position by their power to control such information in addition to their national power to overwhelm other countries. But China is also well aware of the history of hegemonic powers such as the UK and the US. They have maintained their position through their power to control information in addition to their national power. So primarily, CAN first announced the idea of Digital Silk Road Initiative at the Davos Forum in January 2015, as the Professor Kawashima mentioned before. In this 2015 vision and action of the Chinese government, he outlined hardware-oriented telecommunication Silk Road that would span the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, by building a cross-border optical fiber network on land. Second, developing optical submarine cables. And third, providing satellite communication services. So these three parts are the key base of the Chinese hardware infrastructure for the digital hegemony in the future. Now, for example, I think the cross-border optical fiber network on land, China Telecom started the ultra-low latency transit Silk Road cable that connecting China and Europe in 2016. In the second, in the field of optical submarine cable, China Unicom launched the project of AAE1 submarine cable connecting China and Europe in 2017. And the third field of satellite communication, China Satellite Communications Company that is affiliate of the China National Space Administration is constructing a satellite communication network within the Belt and Road Initiative region using Ka band, high frequency band that enable high speed, high capacity communications. So later, I think around 2019, this telecommunication Silk Road Initiative was renamed the Digital Silk Road And it has become clear that the Chinese government is aiming to develop a global IoT platform for electronic payments and e-commerce, including the software aspect. As in the keynote speech, Professor Kawashima mentioned about the this kind of IoT platform initiative. Chinese government conducted the memorandum of understanding with about the 90 countries along BRI to these memorandum of understanding include the adoption of Chinese standard, making it clear that the China aims not only to cooperate in the construction of communication infrastructure, but also to take control of the IoT platform that will ride on the top of the infrastructure. For example, of the IoT platform, the electronic payment platform of the Ant Group, an Alibaba Group affiliate company that operate Alipay, has already spread to the Southeast Asia and India, and also in Japan. So these e-payment applications can collect and enclose big data, such as who made the purchase, what was purchased, and what the purchase was made in the location. So it is kind of closed within China. It is possible to understand not only the behavior of individuals, but also their preference, lifestyle, and even the political tendency based on their purchase history. So as we have seen so far, the China's Data Silk Road initiative is based on the hardware of information and communication infrastructure and the software of the IoT platform with the apparent intention of enclosing not only the Eurasian content, but also the world information and seizing the power to control information from the US. So we need, I will finish that, we need to note that the Chinese attempt is based on the geopolitical strategy that will force us to compete with China over the long term, I think more than 30 years from now. So I will stop my presentation here and accept your question and the comment. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Professor Osawa. Thank you very much. Let's bring our panelists all back onto the screen here if we can. I actually would like to take the privilege of the moderator's chair to pose a question to each one of you. I'd like to start with Karen, actually. I'd like to dig a little bit more into this, one of the 6 ideas you mentioned about market asymmetries and this inability for non-Chinese companies to play in the Chinese market in the same way that Chinese technology companies are able to play in the US or the European or the Japanese market. As you look at some of the free trade agreements, whether it's CPTPP or the US-Japan Digital Trade Agreement, trying to set some common standards within those 2 countries that were signed a few years ago, as you look at that landscape of what governments are doing, how effective do you think the policy response has been to try and mitigate the downsides of that market asymmetry that you described?
I think one of the challenges I've been thinking about recently is China's service commitments when they joined the WTO. And so this challenge of, because China has a lot of state levers of control over the economy, over market access, over the players that don't exist in other countries. So, I mean, you saw this when China sanctions the NBA, they can immediately tell Tencent to take the programming down, right? So the same thing is with licensing. So China can make all these commitments on paper about the rules and the principles, but if China doesn't license a market player to come in the market and participate on equal footing like a domestic national champion, it doesn't mean much in the China market, which is 40% of global e-commerce just today. So I think that's really important. The other issue is this role of the state. And so what are the terms? So let's say that you were to be allowed to be in China and you were allowed to be operating under certain terms. Sometimes the worst thing is to be treated like a Chinese company. So what are the requirements for sharing sensitive data, sharing sensitive technology, supporting the state? We're already seeing, this has been going on since 2009, basically. Then 2014 was another big push. Now since 2020, a lot of new rules and measures about how digital platforms and technology firms are going to support the state. And data, as Emily was saying earlier, is a national resource. It's a national security issue for China in very broad terms. And so I think this issue of China's happy to set rules for everybody else, but is it going to matter in the Chinese market? And then the second point I would make is because of the scope and scale of what China's doing and what we've been talking about China building out vertically integrated platforms in Southeast Asia, Japan, India, other places. Data localization may not matter to China if it controls all the data centers. If these things are vertically integrated, they may be okay with that. And so I think this issue of China taking a cafeteria approach to the rules and using the rules to constrain countries that follow the rules while it doesn't have to, I think is also a risk.
Thanks, Karen. I'm going to pick up on some of those themes there and go to Emily next. But before I do, just a reminder for our audience, if you have questions for any of our three panelists, please email those to events@nbr.org, and the team behind the scenes will channel those to me and I'll ask the questions. But Emily, let me pick up on something that you mentioned in your opening remarks about this need for international coordination. So as we move away from just sort of purely market access and sort of, the landscape in which companies have to operate, and we think about some of those bigger geopolitical trends that Professor Osawa put on the table, as you look across the landscape in the Indo-Pacific and actually across the world, where do you see successes with international coordination? And where do you see sort of weak points or examples that you would point to and say, this is a situation that we don't want to see replicated, especially in the context of the US-Japan relationship?
Unfortunately, nowadays, I think one is inclined to see more failures than successes on this front, especially because so many successes that do exist are relatively small scale. And anything effectively as a response risks being small scale on this front. I think I may take like a more historical framing for this and say that one of the advantages of China's system is that they can deploy a long-term strategy and follow through on it. The rest of the international system, and especially perhaps the US, not as successful on this front. But there's a degree of dynamism that exists and an ability to shift on a dime that we've seen historically, and that largely comes from recognition of a crisis situation. And so this isn't looking at the immediate geopolitical landscape, but if you look historically, I think you can see success from those. And the question is whether the international community has recognized a crisis situation at the moment from China's positioning. And Russia's recent moves in Ukraine, I think, have shifted the needle a little bit on this front. It's not a question of US-Japan, but US cooperation with Europe has increased significantly over the past month or so. And if that can be turned into a larger multilateral front to face the rising challenge of not just Russia, but Russia and China, then I think that's where you see things really moving forward.
Thanks very much. I mean, it's interesting thinking about some of the conversations we had through the course of the project on this idea of economic statecraft, the ability of governments to work with private sector players to shape the landscape here a little bit. I want to follow that thread a little bit with Professor Osawa. My impression, sort of working with our research team here, thinking about the conversations we have quite often with policymakers in Washington, D.C., and some recent conversations we had in Europe with policymakers in Paris and London, there does seem to be a growing sense of concern about sort of China's digital ambitions and the need for a more coordinated response. I'd like to ask you your assessment of how you see the Japanese government responding to this challenge, and the level of coordination you see within Tokyo, whether it's among different ministries or between the Japanese private sector and the Japanese government, as your counterparts are looking at the same sets of challenges there.
Michael, I think the Tokyo shared the same vision with the European country, the US, because I was in the government from the 2014 through the 2017. I'm in charge of the National Cyber Strategy at the National Security Secretariat. At that moment, the circumstances in the government is what kind of strategic approach against these kind of Chinese ambition, both in the geopolitical challenges and digital geopolitical challenges. So the Tokyo bureaucrat in the government shares completely with the US and European country about the Chinese ambition to they are constructing the hardware infrastructure whole of the world, such as the submarine cable. And the second, they are making the software IoT platform on that, such kind of e-commerce platform or social network services platform. And third, they are working with the Chinese leading international norms in the digital arena. So the Tokyo's bureaucrat, the strategical point is to encounter these kind of Chinese ambitious, and first of all I think the Tokyo's policy tools are firstly based on the economic development aid for the developing countries. So we use the word of high quality infrastructure offering to the developing country, especially in the Pacific country, to encounter the Chinese motivation to establish their dominance in digital infrastructure arena. So I can say that I think the Tokyo shares completely the strategic view with the Washington and Brussels or London or other European countries. That's my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got time for one question from the audience here, and it's a very contemporary one. So the questioner is asking, thinking about some of the sanctions we've seen imposed on Russia and the limitations imposed on Russia's banking system given the crisis in Ukraine. What do any of the three of you think the implications of this might be for China's moves to establish the renminbi as an international currency, or the digital versions of the renminbi as an international currency? Do you think the crisis in Europe right now is nudging Beijing in a certain direction around this issue of digital currency? So any of the three of you who feel like you want to jump in on that, we can, Karen first, and then anyone else, just raise your hand or finger and I'll call on you next. But Karen, just a real brief couple of minutes if you could.
Sure, no, it's a great question. And I think the first thing I would say is that, like a lot of things that we're talking about, China has a long-term plan. I mean, going back to when Zhou Xiaochuan of the People's Bank of China wanted to put the renminbi in the IMF's SDR in 2009, the search for an alternative basis of backing that would not be the dollar, whether it's the SDR, whether it's gold, something else to back the renminbi so that they could internationalize it. They've been pushing this for a long time because while China is very dependent on dollar trade, it constrains them in certain ways, and they've been seeking to diversify in a lot of ways from the United States. So I would just highlight that it's not that the current situation is pushing them. I think they've been exposed in midstream about what it is they're doing, the connections between China UnionPay, the connections between their own messaging and payment platform, SIPs, and how it's tied to Russia. They're in the middle of something, and they piloted things for the Olympics. And so they have a very strong interest in this, and they have the ability to do certain things currently at the margins to avoid sanctions. And they have longer term ambitions to roll something out that I think is much more ambitious, that really could challenge the dollar in certain ways. And so I guess I would just highlight that, there's a very active program to create, and I guess the last thing I would mention is we see this in all kinds of areas, satellite systems, we talked about the infrastructure, digital currency. China's riding two systems in a lot of these areas simultaneously, and it's easy to discount the ambitious nature of what they're doing. They're going to slide eventually, probably to their own system, but because they still have a heavy foot in the other camp by design and by default, I think we sometimes miss what they're building out and the strategic implications of it.
Great. Thanks, Karen. Osawa-san or Emily, 30 seconds, and then a last final word. Osawa-san, off you go.
Okay, I put another point because the China learned a lot from this Ukrainian warfare, especially the information warfare dimension. So China would like to control the social network service platform because the GAFA can remove all of the disinformation warfare from the Russian Federation, such as the Twitter or YouTube, something like that. So China are carefully looking about this kind of dominance of the social network service platform by the US GAFAs. So China would like to put more these kind of SNS platform toward the developing country through in the Pacific developing country because of they would like to control the information, especially this information campaign from China, to influence these countries to take take cover under the Chinese government. So that's my last comment. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you so much. Emily, any final word from you?
I think I'd second what everyone's saying, and also that the potential of China claiming currency control is probably like well beyond anything we've seen with the US dollar. It's just like, I think a point to make on this front because it would be tied into China's information-enabled payment systems, which grant government control over transactions and visibility into them. So the stakes here are pretty high.
All right. Well, thank you. The stakes are high. Our second panel is trying to respond to some of the challenges that we've talked about here. So let me thank our three speakers, and I'll then very briefly introduce the moderator of our second panel, Lieutenant General Jun Nagashima, who's a senior research advisor to the Nakasone Peace Institute, a long career with the Japan Air Self-Defense Force, former commandant of the Air Command and the Staff College, and then numerous positions, including as a cabinet counselor to the cabinet in Tokyo. So the first military officer to hold that cabinet level position. General, Nagashima, let me turn the floor to you now and ask you to introduce our three speakers for panel 2. And a quick reminder before I let go of the baton here, General Nagashima is going to make his remarks in Japanese. For those of you on WebEx, there's a little globe icon in the bottom left of your screen. If you have that set to original, you will hear his remarks in Japanese as spoken. You can just scroll down through there and select English, or if you're Japanese and you want to listen to one of our English speakers in Japanese through the translators, the little globe icon in the bottom left is the one to use. But General Nagashima, over to you.
ありがとうございます。日本語で、モデレーターをさせていただきます。今、ウィルスさんから親切なご紹介ありましたが、中曽根平和研究所の研究顧問をしております、長島と申します。パネル2は、Responding to the Risk of China Digital Influence ということで、非常に興味深い内容だと思います。第1部においても、皆さん非常にエキサイティングな議論が行われたと思います。私ももともとベルギーというか NATO をですね、中心に30年ほど研究続けておりまして、最近はさらにその NATO から要するに発展する形でですね、さらに新領域、いわゆる宇宙やサイバー、また電磁波空間での研究も進めています。でまたこれに関連して、例えば AI、 だったり、人工知能で、さらにはクォンタム、量子ですね、こういうものの実際のそのセキュリティに対する影響、これについて関心があります。で、またやっぱりそこは当然、現在もやっぱり中国が非常に力を入れております、一帯一路などでよく見られる、例えば量子暗号ですね、この活用。で、さらには気候変動、クライメートチェンジに対する、要するに中国の技術的な関与。で、またさらにはメタバース空間においてもですね、中国が非常に関心を持っているというところで、特に今日のこのセッションはですね、非常にエキサイティングなものになるというふうに期待しているところであります。最近ですね、日本の中では非常に安全保障に対する関心が異常というかですね、急激に高まりました。で、その原因はですね、やっぱりウクライナ侵攻、ウクライナの軍事作戦だったんですね。で、これまで日本ではあまりそのテレビやそういうところで、あまり安全保障や軍事の問題は取り上げられなかったんですが、非常に毎日ですね、ほぼ24時間、すべてこのウクライナ問題の軍事侵攻だったり、中国の問題だったり、技術ですね、ウクライナで使われている新しい技術、これについての解説が前から行われているということでありまして、日本も非常にこの軍事安全保障で、さらにはその先進技術についての関心というものが非常に民衆というか、普通の一般の国民の中で高まっているというふうに思っています。ですのでですね、こういうウェビナーというのは、非常に私は意味があるというふうに思っています。前置きが長くなりましたが、早速パネルの方に入らせていただきたいと思います。今日は3人の素晴らしいスピーカーの方に来ていただいております。まず、ドクター・サマンサ・ホフマンさん。彼女はオーストラリアのですね、戦略政策研究所のシニアフェローをされているということであります。で、2番目がですね、2人目がですね、持永大さん。で、持永さんは今、慶應義塾大学 CFC の研究所の上席研究員という肩書きでおられます。で、3人目は、マット・トゥルピンさん。今、フーバー研究所のですね、ビジングフェロー、また、前のですね、US National Security Council Director for China ということでですね、中国の専門家、また技術の専門家ということでしてあります。非常にですね、活発な議論が展開されるということで、私、非常に期待しております。では、それぞれのパネリストの方にですね、最初、10分弱程度、それぞれのご関心の事項、また問題提起をしていただいて、その後、Q&A のタイムを作りたいと思います。では最初に、サマンサ・ホフマンさん、ぜひよろしくお願いします。どうぞ。
Hi, thanks so much for having me today, and also to NBR for the opportunity to contribute to this volume. My chapter focused on the export of Chinese digital infrastructure globally. And what I mean by digital infrastructure, it refers broadly to the physical hardware and software that enables digital connectivity. So digital infrastructure at the physical layer might include smart cameras, smart cars, smart appliances, and other IoT sensors and devices that help support, in ideal form, real-time decision-making. Technology that enables data storage or data flows, such as 5G, helps to deliver and exchange information, and artificial intelligence and big data processing help to derive value out of that data. For example, fiber optic cables, data centers, and IoT devices enable connectivity in smart cities. All of these facilitate the collection, processing, usage, transfer, and storage of data, and thus the delivery of a wide range of services on which society is becoming increasingly dependent. My chapter describes how each of these technologies, Beijing is exporting each of these technologies globally, specifically giving examples, for instance, of smart cities and data centers and other sorts of exports that I won't go into too much detail in. Sorry, I won't go into too much detail in that in this talk. Instead, I want to focus a little bit more broadly on how do we define risk in this space, because I think oftentimes the conversation about the risks associated with Chinese technologies is overly narrow. We see the debate on companies like Huawei and the risks associated with the intelligence law and other state security laws related to potential espionage. We focus on things like the coercive elements of smart cities like surveillance. And that happens, although each of those things is important, I don't want to undermine them, that happens at the expense of conversation on how each of these technologies, which provide normal everyday services that many governments would seek to provide, can also undermine security interests. I think the best way that I can describe this is through a case study, which I refer to in the chapter, and it's also based on a report that I did in 2019 called Engineering Global Consent. And the case study refers to a Chinese company called Global Tone Communications Technology, which I found in my research is controlled by the Central Propaganda Department, and they're engaged in machine translation. Machine translation on its own doesn't necessarily sound like an activity that would be specifically linked to activities that undermine liberal democratic interests, and yet this company directly connects its activity to China's state security strategy and in particular propaganda strategy. One of the things that the company claims that it does is provide a translation service that's embedded in Ali Cloud, as well as, say, Huawei smart conferencing solutions. The smart conferencing solution, for instance, GTCom embeds a device in this solution, which is provided in many smart cities packages that Huawei provides globally. And the issue isn't so much that, well, it could be that a company like GTCom would be enabling espionage or listening in specifically to those conversations. It would more be that the data that's collected in order to provide more accurate translations would also contribute to the company's simultaneous efforts to improve automatic text generation. And so the company also talks about things like its ability to automatically generate text and its ability to contribute to propaganda. There's a lot of research in China that looks at the same business model as a way of improving China's capacity to generate fake news comments under articles. So it's sort of an example that helps to highlight that data that's seemingly insignificant in isolation can actually be quite significant when aggregated. And it really just depends on not only the end user of that technology, but also whoever has access downstream to the data that it helps to generate. And so part of what I highlight in this chapter is that if we don't sort of adequately define risk and think broadly enough about what data sets might be of strategic value to the PRC, then we aren't developing effective, or we aren't able to develop effective responses. Another issue that I focus on in this chapter related to the export of digital infrastructure, and something that Emily covers in sort of a different aspect in her chapter, is the standard setting that takes place through the export of China's digital infrastructure. So rather than looking at China's role in international standard settings bodies, I talk a little bit more specifically about how domestically there are technical committees responsible for developing the standards for systems like facial recognition systems or database schema that would be part of a smart cities platform. These standards are developed in coordination between companies and researchers from research institutes such as the Ministry of Public Security, if you're talking about facial recognition systems. And technology within China is designed to meet the needs of the party state and designed specifically to meet those standards. Obviously, as standards are developed and projects are awarded, you have a bit of a, I guess, change over time. But essentially, in order to win a domestic contract, companies are required to meet government contract. Companies are required to meet those standards. Now, if companies are designing technologies to meet those standards, those same technologies are also the ones that are going global that I discuss in this chapter. So a different kind of standard setting happens through creating buy-in or through the normal market activity that these companies are engaged in globally. And so, that's an important aspect that's a risk that is sometimes overlooked. I think I'm getting close to 10 minutes here. So I'll just quickly wrap up and say that there's no easy solution to the kinds of problems that I present in my chapter. I think that part of what can be done is that liberal democracies can develop a better approach for identifying strategic data sets and conducting due diligence on digital supply chain security risks, like the kinds of risks I highlighted in the GTCOM example. That would require having a much more detailed knowledge of which companies are perhaps contributing to propaganda department work or directly linked to propaganda department work, or PLA or other sort of aspects of the Chinese state security system. And propaganda, to be clear, is just one example that I provide. Another would be to develop responses to China's use of technology to expand its power globally by better understanding that technology develops on a trajectory and capabilities are likely to improve over time rather than remain static. Oftentimes we look at what China's doing and assume that its current capabilities or problems it faces, say with data integration, are more of a challenge than they are. And so our responses don't necessarily meet the challenge, I guess. And finally, I guess the final recommendation that I make is around liberal democracies adopting a more multidisciplinary approach to due diligence, thinking Karen described in her talk a little bit that this approach can't be country agnostic and must account for country-specific policy drivers. It must also take into account digital supply chain risks associated with data collection and use. I'll stop there and go to, Matt next.
はい、サマンサさん、大変ありがとうございました。素晴らしいプレゼンテーションでした。今、日本でも経済安全保障に関する法律をですね、進める動きがあって、やっと日本の中でも、こういうもの、中国のそういうデジタルへのアプローチですね、これについての関心が高まっているのかなと思っています。また後ほどこれについて議論ができればいいと思っています。では次は早速ですが、持永先生にお願いしたいと思います。持永先生、よろしくお願いします。
ありがとうございます。Thank you, General Nakashima. My name is Dai Muchinaga, and it's a pleasure to speaking alongside such an area of experts. I would like to talk about the Digital Silk Road and its constraints. The Digital Silk Road is a part of the Belt and Road Initiative, and it's based on China's vision to internationalize its value on the implementation of information technology. My key takeaways are the impact of Digital Silk Road can be explained by the concept of dual circulation. And China still have challenges in promoting the Digital Silk Road. The goal of Digital Silk Road is strengthening China's national power. To achieve this goal, Chinese government and industries promote its projects pursuing economic growth or the military modernization and shaping global rules. Its tools are a wide variety of products and services with information and communication technology. China leverages these technologies to make other countries dependent on Chinese economy and technology, such as telecommunication infrastructure, mobile payment platforms, or social medias. I'd like to point out that earning return through Digital Silk Road can be explained by the concept of the dual circulation. And its problems are locked in the state infrastructure and influence on how to implement technology to our society. The Chinese Communist Party released the concept of dual circulation in 2020, and the dual circulation describes interaction of domestic and overseas ecosystems. It underpins its economic strategy, aiming to boost the innovation of its industries and make them more competitive globally. It also strengthens Beijing's influence on other states by increasing the dependencies to the Chinese technologies and economies. Regarding the dual circulation, there are 3 stages in increasing dependency and get returns. The first stage is of domestic circulation. First stage is domestic circulation. The government supports technology development and protecting industries with regulations and subsidies. This support has made Chinese industry more competitive and prepared for going to the global market. The second stage is dual circulation, is internationalizing these technologies through overseas development. And Belt and Road Initiative's major projects such as the highways or trains or seaports have contributed to exporting developed technologies in China and platforms developed in China to overseas. These projects have also enhanced the interdependency between China and these countries in economy and technology. Telecommunication and digital payment platforms are a good example of China's focusing area. When China's industry tries to go out, standardization is a key to increase its dependency. Chinese industries have standardized technologies at international organizations with the support of Beijing. This support is critical for industries to compete with the dominant players that have set global standards, technology standards for a long time. The success of strategic standardization enables China to offer infrastructure with globally standardized technologies at low cost. The third stage is getting return and exercising influence. China derives the return associated with technologies from widespread platforms and infrastructure. For example, Chinese companies get a patent fee from other countries' telecom operators and manufacturers, and it benefits Chinese industries and will circulate domestic investment and technology developments again. As a result, the more spreading Chinese technology along with the digital Silk Road, and more dependent on them. The e-commerce and online payment through broadband internet access has become a part of everyday life, and it is difficult for people to abandon them, and the state's infrastructure are locked into Chinese products and services. China is preparing to, also I would like to point out the rulemaking initiated by China. China is preparing to take over the ongoing discussion on rulemaking for cyberspace. The global community started a discussion about rules in cyberspace regarding privacy or the data protection or intellectual property and security, along with UN or G20 summit or the other international bodies. And also the first session also mentioned about global initiative on data security. China established a proposal regarding a rulemaking for cyberspace governance. It called for taking a balanced approach to technological progress and economic development and protection of national security and public interests. This global security and global initiative on data security follows China's principle on data governance and sovereignty, which are different from ongoing discussion in United Nations or G20. Also, I'd like to point out that these BRI projects and the Digital Silk Road projects are compatible with authoritarian regimes, wherein the government intends to use centralized power to control its citizens with technologies. China applied its system to 1.3 billion people in its territory and achieved economic development with information control. Therefore, some countries regard China's technology and regulatory system in the cyber domain as an ideal model. However, regarding the constraint, there are still challenges for China. It has tried to be independent of Western technologies and platforms for decades, but China still dependent on them. For example, it relies on importing certain products such as high-end semiconductors or softwares and databases. And some countries selected not to use Chinese products. For example, Vietnamese telecommunication carrier decided not to use Huawei's equipment, and also Singapore telecom operators selected Ericsson or Nokia for 5G infrastructure. And also, China's engagement on rule setting is not enough. China aggressively encouraged other countries support the proposal of cyberspace governance, but only Burma or Cambodia showed their support. Regarding and also how to react to these engagement by China, I would like to point out the core of Japan's reaction to the digital Silk Road is free and open Pacific. The free open Indo-Pacific shaped Japan's reaction to digital Silk Road, and Japan tried to support other countries' 5G infrastructure development or subsea cable implementation. And such a kind of example showed how to support Japan, how to support Japan support to other countries, and as a result, counter digital Silk Road. I will stop here. Thank you.
こちらさん、大変ありがとうございました。非常に聞いていて重要なキーワードがいくつもあったと思います。これはサマンサさんも指摘してたポイントですけども、やはり中国への依存という言葉であったり、もしくは標準化、スタンダーダイゼーションですね、あとルール作り、こういうものがやはり今後の中国のいわゆるデジタルの面からの戦略的なアプローチ、これの一つの柱になっているのかというふうに感じました。では最後のスピーカー、トゥルピンさんに、ぜひお願いしたいと思います。ではどうぞ、トゥルピンさん。
Well, thank you so much, and thank you to my colleagues on from the report, as well as my Japanese colleagues. I really do wish that we could be together in person. Hopefully soon we will all be able to meet. But it's a great opportunity to be able to chat with you. So first, I wanted to maybe start with a couple of remarks. One sort of thanking and expressing sort of my gratitude as a former U.S. government official at the enormous leadership that Japan has shown in understanding the challenges that we're facing, and setting out really what are many of the key sort of policy recommendations and policy paths that we should take. And so I'm going to go through the sort of the 8 areas that I highlighted in my chapter, but I wanted up front sort of acknowledge that much of this work comes from the leadership that the Japanese government has shown, really over the last decade. And that starts with the conception and the promulgation of a free and open Indo-Pacific, and that concept that we should insist upon really an international system that sort of roots itself in the rule of law, in the values of liberal democracies, in the values of market economies, and it was really sort of Tokyo that took the lead for that, and has been the centerpiece of that, really going on a decade now. The concepts around economic security. So just in the past sort of 2 years, the development and putting in place the sort of economic security infrastructure within the Japanese government, across the cabinet, and within the National Security Secretariat, to think about those challenges that sort of economic and commercial activities pose to Japan, and using that as a model for the rest of us to sort of to emulate. And so, I certainly gained a lot from that as I sat within the U.S. government. The concept around data free flow with trust, is a Japanese concept that is infusing itself across other liberal democracies to think about what these challenges should look like. And lastly, sort of the leadership that Japan has shown in terms of reimagining multilateral trade regimes, and really provisions around digital trade, which I think are critical. And so those sort of 4 areas I think are foundational to what we're going to have to do to succeed. And Japan is already sort of leading in those areas. And so, maybe I'll kind of go through the kind of 8 specific policy recommendations that sort of I made in the report. And the first one was really primarily a message to American policymakers about aligning data privacy laws to fit with some of the other constructs that and largely around GDPR that sort of exist in the space, so that liberal democracies could come together and have a common framework to talk about data and to talk about what are the kind of regulatory and policy provisions we want to have in place to be able to do that. And that, I think, requires a degree of alignment across a number of democracies. And primarily, I think that's a U.S. responsibility to sort of come into line with that. Number two, for us to sort of understand the landscape of platforms that some of my colleagues discussed, as well as the digital services that are provided. We as me as a former government official, and for some folks who may be on this call who are currently government officials, I think we should admit that we don't have a very good understanding of that commercial landscape. We don't exactly understand, and I think we all learned this through sort of the learning of discovery that came with the challenges we were dealing with Huawei, is that we didn't fully understand sort of where that sat across our telecommunications networks. We didn't fully understand what that meant across our undersea cables. We didn't fully understand all of those sorts of things. We didn't necessarily understand the commercial dynamics of contracts. And so I think fundamentally, sort of the second recommendation is around gaining sort of what I would call as a common operating picture of the commercial and economic landscape in the digital world, right? That in order for us to take action in that, we have to understand what the environment is. And I think for those of us with military backgrounds, we sort of fundamentally understand that in order for you to sort of devise a campaign to achieve an objective, you sort of need to know where the mountains and the rivers are. You sort of need to understand what the terrain looks like to be able to act in that space. And I think we need that within this construct. The third recommendation I would make is that I think it is absolutely fundamental that liberal democracies commit to much higher R&D, research and development spending. And I think unfortunately, while the United States and the PRC have seemed to be sort of competing in like a nearly sort of nearly a 45-degree angle up in terms of the spending that we've committed, unfortunately, across many of other liberal democracies, it has remained stagnant or flatlined, and we need to make much greater contributions. We're starting to see some of that, but I think it requires a real commitment to be able to make that happen. The fourth recommendation sort of I made in the chapter was around fundamentally rebuilding electronics manufacturing capability in places other than the PRC. Unfortunately, over the last 2 decades, we have allowed the PRC to sort of take advantage of market forces to gain a sort of a commanding position across the manufacturing sector of commercial electronics, but then many of the sort of the electronics that we depend upon. And it's what makes our ability to control semiconductor flows and other things very difficult. If the PRC makes 90%, or assembles 90% of the world's smartphones, it's really hard for us to understand how we would continue to deny cutting edge things to them. We need to shift to a degree some of that manufacturing infrastructure. Here again, I sort of commend the Japanese government for being having quite a bit of foresight here in really beginning to send strong signals to your own companies to diversify your manufacturing base, whether that's through Southeast Asia or reshoring back to Japan, but really that effort to sort of diversify manufacturing dependencies is something that we'll need to be able to do over the long run. Number 5 And this sort of goes to some of the things that were raised around standard setting. I think fundamentally, we have to understand that the PRC is sort of a bad faith actor in standard setting bodies. And we will likely need to establish new standard setting bodies and fundamentally exclude the PRC from initial standard setting, right? So that we can get to what is technologically sort of the best thing that we want, and it aligns with the democratic values that we want to be able to have, right? So, this sort of goes back to that first one about aligning sort of privacy and sort of other civil liberty issues. But fundamentally, we'll have to bake those into the standards. And I fear that simply cannot be done with sort of pretending that this is business as usual and allowing the PRC and its commercial entities to sort of act, and participate in a normal way. That likely means that we'll find ourselves with sort of two different standards. But fundamentally, I think Beijing is already selecting that path. And so that is sort of already baked into this, and we'll probably have to just sort of accept that. The sixth sort of area of recommendation is really about reconstructing a digital ecosystem that takes on the values and properties and characteristics of liberal democracies and market economies. And so, I kind of put that as, we obviously had a digital infrastructure that sort of looked like that. It was sort of put together ad hoc. I would call that digital infrastructure 1.0. The PRC has begun to work on a digital infrastructure 2.0. And fundamentally, we're going to probably have to insist upon a 3.0 that gets us back to the kinds of values and properties that we'd want to see. The seventh recommendation is really around coordinating our regulatory and policy tools to sort of achieve that goal of a different infrastructure. And when we think about the sort of the policy tools that we'd be talking about, it's probably a combination of export controls, investment screening tools, potentially outbound investment tools. It's probably about the subsidies and provisions we provide, whether that's through government provisioning that we provide inside our own system. But it's the mix of sort of policy levers that we need to bring into place to achieve the outcome of what we would want in terms of a digital infrastructure. And then I think, lastly, the sort of the eighth recommendation that I ended on, goes back again to something that Japan has led on, which is setting up the kind of multilateral trade regimes that begin to realize this. And I think that the digital trade provisions is the right place to start, and we already have a number of sort of relatively good models to be able to build off of. And we probably now need to stitch those. We need to spend our time stitching those together. And it's likely outside of the WTO regime. And it's something that is separate from that. Fundamentally, I don't think that we're simply going to be able to achieve the kinds of outcomes that we want in a forum like the WTO, where the PRC will simply resist the ability for us to be able to move forward. We have to demonstrate that there are better ways to be able to do this with our own trading rules. And then in that demonstration of being able to provide better outcomes, we'll watch as other countries sort of move to that. But fundamentally, we'll likely have to build it first ourselves and then demonstrate that it works. And so those are the sort of my quick ones. And, and again, many thanks to my Japanese colleagues who over the years have been the ones that have helped me develop some of these ideas, and I give really all credit to them. They've been incredible in making this work. So thank you.
マットさん、ありがとうございました。非常に日本に対しての、温かい言葉も非常に感動しましたし、またぜひですね、対面でお会いしたいなというふうに思います。 もうすみません、時間が来てしまったんですけれども、最後にですね、お一人ずつにコメントいただきたいと思っていることが一つあります。それはやっぱり現在のウクライナの情勢なんですね。で、やっぱりそのウクライナの中では通常のコンベンショナルなその兵器が使われてますが、実際では裏ではもっと大きなデジタルのその戦いがあって、それが現在非常に大きく注目されていると。で、現在やはり今回中国はやはり今回のウクライナの要するに戦い方、デジタルの戦い方をしっかり注目していると私は見ています。で、今後多分東アジアではこの台湾の問題というのが同じようになってきて、で皆さんのそれぞれのご専門の立場から今回、中国はですね、今回のこのウクライナからどういうものを教訓として要するに学んでですね、これを今後どういう形で要するに中国として能力を向上させていこうと思っているのか。でまだそれ現在の状況続いているので、これは言えないんですけど、皆さんの感想内容でもですね、すみません、短いで大体1分ぐらいでですね、それぞれコメントをお聞きしたいというふうに思います。サマンサさんからでよろしいですか？申し訳ありません。
Thank you. So I have to say that because I've been traveling for the last 3 weeks, I feel like I'm not as informed as I need to be on all the details of the topic. But I think that where I've paid a little bit more attention is just on the information campaigns that the PRC is waging. And one thing that I think is important to state is that a lot of what we're seeing, although current events are new, the threat perceptions that the party state is acting on are not. And neither are the sort of fundamental nature of the information campaigns that we're seeing. So if you think about the way that the PRC has reacted to, say, the color revolutions, the Jasmine Revolution, you see for a number of years now decades really, that the PRC sees political threats to the party emerging from outside of China, not just inside of China. And so the sort of importance of shaping the information environment is always constant, or it's constant rather. And so with issues, I mean, you can even tie, China's discourse around sanctions to the development of DCEP and even international aspects of the social credit system. You can tie a more recent conversation, sort of colluding with Russia on the US and the development of bioweapons to China's response to, or criticism of China's response to COVID-19 early on. So I guess there's a lot here that is new, but then also we have sort of to, I guess, look further back at how China's been developing responses to threat perceptions for quite a long period in order to really understand where the change will be.
ありがとうございました。非常に包括的な答えでありがとうございました。では、持永さん、よろしくお願いします。
Okay, it's a very tough question as for me, but I would like to point out two things. One thing is China realized the impact of sanctions, which means the cutting off from the SWIFT network will impact not only its economy but also their showing how their business is not going on in the future. And also, I would like to point out the criticality of the cybersecurity. For China, they are trying to protect shields up more for their critical infrastructure to protect from the cyber attacks. But also the influence of the cyberspace is expanded not only the people around that kind of area, but also around the world. Also Japanese people and other countries' people is moved by their messages and also how to counter their invasion. For example, in the cyberspace, there are so many people watching what is happening in Ukraine, and how to counter these actions. They are thinking about how to counter these actions, which are based on our infrastructure, especially in the cyberspace. That two things in China is realized. Thank you.
大
Maybe
変あ
I'll
りがとうございました。非常になんですかね、眼蓄でインプリケーションのある、回答ありがとうございました。では、最後、トゥルピンさんお願いします。
Yeah. So obviously there are a number of close similarities between the justification that Vladimir Putin gave for his invasion of Ukraine, and the language that the Chinese Communist Party uses when it talks about Taiwan, right? You know, each both Moscow and Beijing assert that the other country doesn't exist. It asserts that you know, it has essentially the right to annex the other. I think that for Beijing, there has to be a number of sort of important lessons that come out of this, and I think most of this comes from the Chinese Communist Party's sort of fundamental sort of look at political unity and sort of the political side of how conflict works as being central, right? And I think there's two things that I think certainly Beijing, if it is paying attention, should draw as very critical lessons from this. And the first would be Ukraine's domestic political unity that's been demonstrated sort of over these past 5 weeks, and the fact that Vladimir Putin launched a war in which there wasn't really domestic political splits, and that in launching that war, it has made Ukraine far more united in its defense. And I can imagine that for the PRC, that is not a good condition to be in for them to feel that they could launch a conflict. They would, I would believe, feel that they need to have significant domestic political schisms within Taiwan in order to justify. And then the other sort of equally important side of this is the international political unity that has been formed in the process of this conflict, right? Because Moscow was unable to achieve its objectives in a short, sharp conflict, right? Essentially achieve, a lightning strike that forces the Ukraine to concede. The longer this goes on, the more that international sort of condemnation aligns against Moscow, and the kinds of things that would be quite harmful to the PRC begin to be used and refined. And unfortunately, I don't think Beijing has many good mitigations to this, largely because their economy is still extremely dependent upon exports to markets that would be the ones who would be most likely to cut them off, which would then cause enormous challenges for them as this drags out over time. And so I think that sort of these lessons about political unity and disunity have to be quite important for the party. This is why they spend so much time on the digital infrastructure and the digital space in order to shape those perceptions, those political perceptions. And I think that what they would have to conclude from this is, even though Moscow spent significant energy to try and create the conditions, it didn't come about. And so Beijing would probably have to think about even greater efforts to do this, to be able to achieve their ends.
トゥルビさん、ありがとうございました。日本でも非常にやっぱりこのウクライナの問題が関心を集めているのは、やっぱり台湾とウクライナは違いますけれども、やはり同じような状況がやっぱり東アジアに起きるんじゃないかという、やっぱり日本人が非常にやっぱり なんですかね、心配しているということだと思います。で、やはり通常のその戦力じゃなくて、やっぱりこういうサイバー攻撃だったり、電磁波攻撃だったり、宇宙への攻撃っていうのは、台湾だけではなくて、日本も同じようにこの戦争の中に巻き込まれるわけなので、そういう点でいうと、こういう皆さんとの今日の議論をですね、さらに大きく広げていくとですね、非常に面白い安全保障上の観点があるのかなと思いました。すみません、短い時間でありましたが、皆さんもですね、もっと議論していただきたかったんですが、時間の関係でこれで終了させていただきます。では、ウィルさんにお返ししたいと思います。よろしくお願いします。
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think one of the signs of a good, robust discussion is we still have much to talk about, and we still have a high level of enthusiasm, even as the time has run out. I just have to say a few thank yous and wrap up our proceedings today. First, thank you very much to our 6 speakers and panelists for sharing your insights, for answering questions. Really appreciate your expertise and spending the time with us today. Second, I need to thank the Institute of War and Peace Reporting and the Department of State, which provided the grant that supported the research project. The report is available on NBR's website. There's a Japanese translation, a summary translation available now, and a Japanese translation of the full report will be available next month. On NBR's website, there's also an interactive data tool that sort of tells some of the story of China's digital ambitions in a way that users can manipulate the data and sort of see the implications themselves. Third, I need to thank my colleagues at NBR, Audrey Mossberger, Jonathan Marek, and Doug Strube with our Trade Center, who did all the behind-the-scenes work for this, and also to our 2 interpreters today, Naomi Kazawa and Asaka Fujita. Thank you so much. It's an incredibly difficult job for you 2 to do simultaneous translation, and we appreciate the work that you've done today. Fourth, I very much appreciate our partnership with the Nakasone Peace Institute, General Nagashima for your moderation of the second panel, Ambassador Fujisaki for your kind opening remarks. As Matt mentioned in his opening comments, we're looking forward to the ability to get back to Tokyo and do these sorts of things in person, and hope that won't be too much longer before we're able to see you in person and do that. And fifth and finally, thank you to our audience who joined us this evening in the US and this morning in Tokyo. We've had almost nobody leaving the session. I think that's another sign that the discussion has been very robust and interesting for our audience. Thank you for taking the time to spend this with us today. And we look forward to seeing you at future events. And with that, I will sign off. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.